Thank you for streaming with us here on CBS News Chicago. I'm Marisa Vedra. 40 years ago, the Tylenol murders gripped this area. 7 were left dead, so many were fearful, and that case remains unsolved. Over the course of the last few months, our team of CBS 2 investigators have been taking a new look at this case, digging in brand new ways, and finding evidence that may surprise you and add to the layers of this investigation. They're putting it all together for a docuseries called Painkiller, premiering later this fall. Let's take a look.
It was probably one of the first acts of domestic terrorism.
A frightening pattern began to take shape some 5 hours later in the neighboring suburb of Arlington Heights.
When you live through something like that, you'll never forget it.
This was a terrible tragedy for 7 families.
He took my life, shattered my life and my family life.
Calls have been coming into the investigative task force so heavily that all 7 lines into the center have been almost constantly jammed.
If it can happen with this, what else can it happen?
Have you found the common denominator?
No, sir. We're working in conjunction with Johnson & Johnson in an effort to determine if there is a common denominator.
Who would think of that? What kind of mind thinks about that?
The search for the Tylenol cyanide killer continues to center on this photograph.
Have you ever done an interview about this?
No, only with the FBI.
7 people? You're gonna let a murderer just go?
Why can't the authorities arrest this man?
He's a madman.
Kansas City Police Sergeant David Barton was watching an evening news broadcast when he saw a picture of a man who looked familiar.
I jumped off the couch, said, "That's damn James Lewis."
You remember the name Lewis?
I just told you that 3 times.
Just another one of the ups that plague this case.
We're actively pursuing this investigation. This is not collecting dust on a shelf.
I don't think it'll ever be solved. For 40 years, you would think that somebody would say something.
You ever seen this guy? Hi, Mr. Lewis?
If this was on the shelves then, we wouldn't be sitting here now.
I'm joined now with CBS 2 investigator Brad Edwards and streaming anchor for CBS News Chicago. We saw you in that piece. So looking forward to your work on Painkiller. But our CBS 2 viewers will know that you and the rest of the CBS 2 investigators working on this have a series of specials airing this week looking at the case. And I want to talk to you about that now so we can look ahead to Brad's piece that is airing Friday night at 10. In this, you're focusing on the suspects.
Yeah.
Where did you start? I mean, an overwhelming amount of information to even start digging into.
Overwhelming amount of information. And it's interesting, too. A lot of the information we actually gleaned was from our file footage, the story as it really happened, because now that information has really been shut down to the public, as this is still an open investigation. 40 years, though, unsolved, 7 dead. Some people call it an act of terrorism, one of the first in American history. And so far, no one has actually paid for those crimes, the 7 actual murders. Now, Marie, we started taking a look at the suspects. You got to keep in mind, this was a law enforcement apparatus was put together when people started literally dropping dead after taking extra strength Tylenol. A law enforcement apparatus was put together like had never been seen before in the United States. Illinois State Police, Chicago Police, 4 or 5 different suburbs, and the FBI. There were 126 members of that task force at one point in time. 24 from the FBI. They had 7 lines fielding tips. Thousands of tips came in. They really narrowed it down pretty quickly to 3 suspects. A gentleman by the name of Roger Arnold. He was found with cyanide and weapons in his home. He also worked at a jewel warehouse, and he also worked with the father of one of the 7 victims. Roger Arnold since passed away at a very troubled life after he was named a suspect in the case. He's now no longer obviously in the picture. Another gentleman was named Kevin Masterson. He was of Lombard. He was said to have had a long-time grudge against Jewel. he was soon after, really in the early going, ruled out. And then there's always been a suspect number 3.
I know that's the one that's getting the most attention for your work, not only on Painkiller, but again in your piece airing on Friday.
Yeah, so suspect number 3, name is James Lewis. To those who have followed the case, that will not be an unfamiliar name. James Lewis was eventually convicted of an extortion attempt in this case. He wrote a letter to Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiary that makes Tylenol in the days following the deaths of the 7 individuals in Chicago, saying in that letter, I will stop the killings, as if he were the killer. I will stop the killings, stop the poisonings, stop putting cyanide into extra strength Tylenol if you forward $1 million to said bank account in Chicago. He was eventually convicted of that attempted extortion. It never took place. Fingerprints led directly back to him. There was a nationwide manhunt at one point in time. Authorities could never put him in Chicago at the time. There was always some thought, though, that he didn't need to be in Chicago. These could have been placed on store shelves weeks prior to them being purchased. He did go away to prison for a dozen years, and our investigation on the 10 o'clock news on Friday really focuses on not only his connections to the Tylenol killings, but his history that is just littered with dark allegations of bad deeds.
When you were chasing him down, specifically the 3rd suspect, looking into his background, did anything give you a little thrill as you're digging? You investigate all the time. I'm curious if anything jumped out at you that made you think, okay, I'm really onto something here, or made you push even harder to get information from him, to find him, to have him be a piece, part of this piece that you're working on.
Yeah, and you're right. There is that jolt of energy when you're investigating something like this and you find a little nugget.
Right.
I went to the National Archives, looked at the entire case file, more than 1,000 pages laid out really against James Lewis. I mean, it started from moment one. You know, I found out he was born to parents in Memphis, Tennessee. He was soon after abandoned by said parents. He was then adopted and raised in a little place near the Ozarks called Carl Junction, Missouri. Then at a young age tried to murder his adoptive mother with an axe, then spent 2 years in a mental health hospital. At that point in time, it was known as a lunatic asylum in Nevada, Missouri. But then the real thrust of my focus was what happened 4 years before the Tylenol murders took place. They took place in '82. We got a flashback to 1978. In 1978, a tax client of James Lewis was a tax man. His client, Raymond West, was found murdered and dismembered, and his mummified remains were found in the attic of his Kansas City home. And I thought, I've got to track everything I possibly can. I've got to track everything down about the murder of Raymond West that's available. And I found the prosecutor who prosecuted the case, found the detective who was one of the lead homicide detectives for the Kansas City Police Department at the time. And something that's remarkable in this case, we're 40 years removed. So keep in mind, a lot of the key protagonists, a lot of the key players are dead.
Right. Adds to the hurdles. These guys are not, the prosecutor, the detective, are not only not deceased, but are of complete sound mind. The prosecutor in the Kansas City case is one of the most remarkable characters I've ever really spoken to. He was with, before becoming a millionaire, by suing nursing homes. That's by his own framing of it. He was with the prosecutor's office for just a couple of years. When he left the prosecutor's office, he brought one dossier with him, one manila folder, and it had the several-page memorandum on the murder
of Raymond West.
Wow. So that's stuck with him always.
Stuck with him always. And the key suspect in that case was James Lewis. Raymond West was a tax client of James Lewis. I mean, we lay it all out in the piece that comes. But, you know, one of the critical elements that broke that case initially open was after Mr. West disappeared, James Lewis tried to cash a $5,000 check from the missing man. And
you're pulling on all these threats.
And there's red flag after red flag after red flag. That case eventually was dismissed. It was thrown out. It was kicked because some critical evidence that was found in James Lewis's vehicle included similar ropes and similar slip knots that were used to hoist the victim's dismembered body up into the attic.
Wow.
James Lewis, who was a suspect, wasn't given his Miranda warning, wasn't read his Miranda rights. You have a right to an attorney. You do not need to speak. Truly a technicality. Case got kicked.
Wow.
A couple of years later, James Lewis was the center of an investigation that was really a large investigation involving identity fraud and land fraud. That was 1981-ish. It was a federal case and a state case. The feds and the local cops swept into Lewis's home in Kansas City. They got a bunch of evidence. They thought they had a good case. Bam. James Lewis skips town, comes to Chicago. 1 year later, the Tylenol murders.
For those of you watching, you can tell how deeply sourced, read in, researched Brad is. Our entire team of CBS 2 investigators have spent so much time on this. I don't want to toot our own horn, but I would love you to explain to our viewers how much work, travel, other things have been put in to get to the product that they're going to see in your piece Friday at 10 and ultimately in Painkiller.
Yeah, you'll see a sliver of that really in the 10 o'clock news, and then the lion's share in the larger docuseries Painkiller that we have dropping this fall. I mean, it's been thousands of miles we've traveled, and it's been a lot of man hours, But you know, the key is those little golden nuggets you happen upon. You know, I mean, it starts out as a complete blank slate,
right?
And
you don't know what you're going to find.
No idea what I was going to find. I certainly didn't think I was going to find out what I did find out. And the balls that were dropped in the Kansas City crimes in particular are pretty mind-boggling. And I didn't think such things would be unearthed, and I didn't think we'd be able to get at them, let alone get the documentation to it all, because you got to keep in mind this is still an open investigation. This is being headed by Arlington Heights Police, where 3 individuals died after they took the cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol capsules, but the FBI is still involved. So the availability to get records involving any of the suspects or anything that happened has been extremely difficult. But it was really that one call out of left field I made to a guy I thought was likely the prosecutor back in 78, 79, 81 in Jackson County, Missouri. And I said, hey, do you remember anything? He says, do I remember anything? I have the file in my desk drawer. And I said, can you fax that to me?
And he did.
And he did. And that was really the beginning of an epic journey, which has included multiple trips to Boston in an effort to find James Lewis.
And try to talk to him.
Yeah, so we have gone there 2 times now. The first time we went there, it was really a shot in the dark. I mean, we were really just, we do a lot of door knocking as reporters. You go to someone's door, you knock on it, and you want to hear their story. You want to expose what they know. You want the public to hear what they have to say, no matter what their story. But this was a pretty huge undertaking for a door knock, and
Very much so.
It was like a knock, knock, knock.
And
it was a buzzer.
Ring of that buzzer.
A buzzer, buzzer, buzzer in
saw that in the
Cambridge, Mass, on a Monday morning, and sure enough, James Lewis answered the door, and it was the first time he'd really publicly been seen in more than a decade. He has really, he is still suspect number one, and he knows that. But I think it was at a time that we caught him before really all the media started grasping onto the 40-year anniversary. So
Right.
it was,
That was
a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What is your reaction now, seeing all the attention? Obviously, this week is the anniversary of that first death, correct? So there is more attention. There has been news that Lewis is being spoken to again as part of this investigation. For you, working on this for months and months, seeing this attention now, does it surprise you at all?
Well, it was interesting. We talked with Arlington Heights Police just a couple weeks ago, just after Labor Day. I showed them my entire exchange with James Lewis. They asked me for a copy of that interview, and then I know through sources that members of the task force 2 weeks later, this being last week, went out to Boston in an effort to further investigative efforts in the Tylenol killings and attempting to talk to James Lewis. I think it's a good thing. I think it is. Listen, everyone's into true crime, but you have to keep in mind there are humans behind all this.
Real families, real pain.
Real families, real pain. I mean, one family lost 3 family members, and we're now 3 generations beyond that. And you want to talk about multi-generational trauma. This is something they live.
Yeah.
So I think investigators, they realize, and ones in the know tell me, this is potentially the last ditch real effort to see if someone will pay for those 7 dead. Because 50 years rolls around.
Oh, yeah. It's even
there aren't going to be many people around.
Yeah.
One of the most fascinating things, we say it's cliche, it's trite, but giving voice to the voiceless. Like that's what we say as journalists, right? When a lot of times it's not really people who are voiceless, it's people who, for some reason, the journalism establishment doesn't try to listen to. But in this case, in focusing on Raymond West, a man who's still quite an enigma, he was the client of Tylenol suspect James Lewis, who was murdered in 1978, 4 years before the Tylenol killings. You truly are giving voice to the voiceless. Sure. I mean, here is a man who was killed 44 years ago, and I think had anyone known then what I even know now, there would have been an uproar.
Wow.
And it was also fascinating, just the history, which will be part of the larger doc series, of what was happening in Kansas City at the time. I mean, one of the detectives tells me Kansas City in 78, 79, 80, 81 was literally blowing up.
Yeah.
There was a huge FBI investigation into the mob and skimming there. I'm like, well, what was that about? He's like, well, have you ever seen the movie Casino? It's based on skimming and the Kansas City mob. So there was a ton going on there, and that is a strange thing when you think, here I am as a reporter following where the story takes me in the indiscriminate murder of 7 individuals in Chicago.
Right.
And the story really takes me to Kansas City.
Well, you're going to see that in Brad's special that is airing on Friday night at 10 here on CBS 2, and you'll see more of his reporting along with the other CBS 2 investigators in the docu-series That is Painkiller, and it's dropping this fall. Do not miss our coverage on this. You can tell in speaking with me, Brad, your work is incredible. I know you all have been so dedicated to this.
Yeah.
We really look forward to seeing it starting Friday at 10. And then again, tune in this fall for the docuseries Painkiller.
It was probably one of the first acts of domestic terrorism.
A frightening pattern began to take shape some 5 hours later in the neighboring suburb of Arlington Heights.
When you live through something like that, you'll never forget it.
This was a terrible tragedy for 7 families.
He took my life, shattered my life and my family life.
Calls have been coming into the investigative task force so heavily that all 7 lines into the center have been almost constantly jammed.
If it can happen with this, what else can it happen?
Have you found the common denominator?
No, sir. We're working in conjunction with Johnson & Johnson in an effort to determine if there is a common denominator.
Who would think of that? What kind of mind thinks about that?
The search for the Tylenol cyanide killer continues to center on this photograph.
Have you ever done an interview about this?
No, only with the FBI.
7 people? You're gonna let a murderer just go?
Why can't the authorities arrest this man?
He's a madman.
Kansas City Police Sergeant David Barton was watching an evening news broadcast when he saw a picture of a man who looked familiar.
I jumped off the couch, said, "That's damn James Lewis."
You remember the name Lewis?
I just told you that 3 times.
Just another one of the ups that plagued this case.
We're actively pursuing this investigation. This is not collecting dust on a shelf.
I don't think it'll ever be solved. For 40 years, you would think that somebody would say something.
You ever seen this guy? Hi, Mr. Lewis?
If this was on the shelves then, we wouldn't be sitting here now.